Okay, thanks very much, Hamid. Okay, hello, welcome everybody to this online event, Zoom event, looking at Sudan's peace process and where we are and what we've learned from past national and international processes. So this is based on some papers and research that have been written by the Peace Research Institute in the University of Khartoum. And it's research and a paper that's been funded by the FCDO and our partner, the British Council. So joining us today, we also have another FCDO partner, which is in the form of the Political Settlements Research Programme, PSRP, which is based at the University of Edinburgh. And we'll talk a bit about PSRP during the presentation as well. But we want to press on with the speakers, the excellent speakers that we have. And they include, first of all, Professor Musa Adam Abdul Jalil, Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Khartoum. And he's also the director of the Peace Research Institute. We've got Dr. Omar Ejimi, who's the Senior Assistant Professor of Natural Resource Management, Faculty of Geography and Environmental Sciences at the University of Khartoum. And we also have Professor Christine Bell, who is with PSRP, who's Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Edinburgh. And she is the Principal Investigator and Director of the PSRP project. So our two speakers to begin with from the University of Khartoum will reflect on the current developments of the Juba Peace Agreement and how this might be impacted by the continuing events in Sudan, including the recent violence in Darfur. And then Christine Bell from the University of Edinburgh will reflect on how similar issues have been addressed in other political transitions and peace processes. So that's who we've got and what we're going to talk about. And just a bit of housekeeping. The event's going to be about an hour and a half long. So we'll spend 45 minutes listening to the excellent presentations, and then we'll have another 45 minutes for Q&A. And the Q&A will be moderated by Abdul Jalil from the British Council, Dr. Abdul Jalil from the British Council. And in the meantime, I'm going to just hand over now to Hamid, who's going to introduce the first speaker. Hamid.
Thank you very much, Kedrick. And meanwhile, Professor Musa and Dr. Umar put on the presentation. You can start sharing your screen now. I will just introduce them briefly. Professor Musa Abdul Jalil is Professor of Social Anthropology and the Director of the Peace Research Institute at the University of Khartoum. His research focuses on the areas of ethnicity, migration, customary land tenure, and traditional mechanisms for conflict management, with a special ethnographic focus on Darfur. He has published widely on the challenges and opportunities for dispute resolution and peace building related to land and farmer relations and forced displacement. He also participated as an expert in many Darfur-related activities, including the Darfur Joint Assessment missions in 2006 and 2012, as well as the Darfur Development Strategy in 2013, and most recently the Darfur Development Strategy Review in 2019. And Dr. Omar Ejimi is an assistant professor at the Department of Geography at the University of Khartoum. His main fields of teaching and research include natural resource management, land tenure, resource-based conflicts, rural development, environmental governance, and traditional pastoralism. He has published widely on resource-based conflict, political ecology, and natural resource management issues. He worked for the UNDP conflict and environment section, also for the United Nations Environment Program in Darfur, working on a research on Sudan post-conflict, and many other posts. So without further ado, I will open the floor for the Peace Research Institute. Please go ahead, Dr. Umar and Professor Musa. And we can't hear you. You might be on mute. Can you unmute, please?
All right.
We can hear you now. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hamid, and very delighted to be with you all. And also, you are very thankful to FCDO for funding this research or lessons learned. And our presentation will be in two parts. The first part, a very short part, or lessons learned from previous peace agreements, and the second part on the present situation and possibly the way forward. This research on lessons learned from previous peace agreements was based mainly on rigorous desk review, as well as wide consultation with different stakeholders, including those who were engaged in the peace agreements from both North and South, currently the Republic of South Sudan. I'm going to give a very brief presentation on just the main findings of the research. And a major conclusion of the research is that none of Sudan peace agreements was successful in bringing peace to Sudan. Rather, they provided for the complexity and the intensification of Sudan conflicts. And in particular, one could refer to East Sudan Peace Agreement, which resulted in an enormous transformation of the power structure of East Sudan, and which we see the impact today in the intensification of the conflict in East Sudan. Also, the peace agreements in both Darfur, whether Abuja in 2006 or the Doha document for peace in Darfur 2011, both resulted in more intensification and division of the community. Also, previous agreements were transactional as elite deals, reflecting interests of negotiating parties rather than commitment to national agenda, and therefore none of this agreement was owned or legitimated by the stakeholder community. As for the Sudanese, they just see this agreement as owned by the negotiating parties, whether from the government of Sudan at that time or from the rebel movements. Also, the agreements were not comprehensive. Instead, these agreements, they were geographically focused, whether in the East or in Darfur or whatever, also parallel, and failed to include key armed actors. Therefore, they revitalized the conflicts and failed to fundamentally transform the state and balance of political power or to address the shared structural causes of the conflicts. In addition, the agreements also, and here we are, when I talk about these agreements, it is about the CPA, Darfur Agreement in Abuja 2006, Eastern Sudan Peace Agreement, and the Doha document for peace in Darfur. The four agreements also failed to change social relationship between communities, both nationally and at the local level. They did not, in fact, address key local drivers and enablers of the conflicts, such as the rights of and access to land and competition over natural resources. Most of these conflicts dealt with structural issues at the national level, but failed to go down to address community-based conflicts. And this is also could be related to the nature of these agreements between the government and the rebel movements. The four agreements also failed to effectively include women and youth groups or to address their political and social exclusion. And therefore, these agreements lacked ownership, recognition, and accountability among these stakeholders who consider these are as exclusive agreement, and therefore didn't address the issues related to them, and therefore they are not owned by these groups. However, also when we look at these agreements, we find that the overarching approach was the emphasis on power and wealth sharing, which in reality inhibits transforming the nature of the state and addressing the root causes of conflict. And if we look at these root causes of conflict, we find that it is a confluence of factors, related to politics, socio-cultural factors, and also economic factors. These have not been really addressed in all these conflicts, and therefore failed to address the root causes. In fact, when we look closely to these agreements, we found that they encourage fragmentation and proliferation of armed groups, neglected local level problems and grievances that are at the heart of the conflict, and provided for deepening the rift between communities. In fact, if we look a quick glance to Darfur, we find that, instead of two movements in 2003, 2004, when Abuja came, as a fractioning started, they became 3 and 4, and at present, they stand for about 79 or 80 conflict groups. Also, the agreements can be described as being tactical and initiated and produced to external pressures and the short-term balance of power between the conflicting parties. And this applies mainly to the government of Sudan and to the rebel movements. They are characterized by lack of trust and genuine commitment to lasting peace, and the incentives to fully implement the agreement. And in fact, mistrust has shaped the whole, environment, or political environment, of even the implementation of these agreements. Therefore, a major pitfall of the agreement was their weak implementation architecture and capacities. They were not implemented effectively due to lack of appropriate mechanisms and coordination mechanisms with clear mandates and institutional or effective monitoring and evaluation and or even accountability system. And a very clear example is the parallel situation in Darfur between Darfur Regional Authority under the Abuja and the Darfur Transitional Authority under the Doha document, where you find the parallel institutions, and none of them trust the other. And even for the implementation of the Doha document, the programmatic arm of this document was the DDS, Darfur Development Strategy. A lot of problems, created during the implementations because the government institutions didn't recognize the DRA, and even for the DRA institutions, they do not work in close relationship with the government structures on the ground. And this dualism of institutions has been one of the major problems, in fact, in the implementation of the peace agreements. Very recently, we did the review of the DDS, Darfur Development Strategy 2013-2019, and this lack of trust and lack of, harmony or cohesion between the two different institutions had been one of the major problems. Even yesterday, me and Professor Musa, we were in a discussion with a number of the so-called Darfur commissions. One of the major problems, faced them was their relationship to the government. And I think this is an issue later on Professor Musa could elaborate on. Because of that, we find that at least these agreements have not been felt by the people as positively impacting their lives. They didn't see the dividends of peace, and because of that, they didn't own it. It is it is an established fact now that no agreement is perfect, but how that agreement is implemented, how it is translated into a positive impact on the livelihood of the people, that is the major issue. And unfortunately, that has never been built by any of these agreements. Additionally, international actors and neighbors' interests are diverse and sometimes conflicting. This has also affected the nature of the peace processes and their outcome. By that, I come to an end on these lessons learned, and I will leave the floor to Professor Musa to continue on the present situation and the implications of that on today's situation in the country.
Thank you, Omar. And, yes. No, sorry. Can you see the shared screen? Hello?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Let me. Yes, because I have to say share screen. Hold on. Oh, sorry.
Is it coming?
It's on now. Yes, please.
It's on now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. So I will just continue from where Omar left, and I will delve directly into characterizing the present situation. And in general terms, now we are seeing severe economic crisis and deepening poverty, which creates a widespread sense of pessimism among the Sudanese in public. And also there is divisions and conflicting interests within the forces of freedom and change, which is the incubator of the government, and of course very prominent parties that are at odds with each other are the Ummah and the Communist Party. This is just an example because these are main historical parties that have conflicting interests. Also, the main divide between the civilian and the military components of the transitional government overshadows most activities and policies, and it is the actually occupies a lot of time in the social media, people discussing the public discussing these different trajectories of the relationship. Also, the main forces of December Revolution, mainly the women and youth, are discontented and struggling to maintain their place in the existing transitional government structure. They expected to be very prominent participants and to get really involved, not only overseeing the government, but also in actually running the government. But so far, their role is quite marginal in terms of membership of the executive part of the government. Also, we are seeing delays in establishing transitional institutions since the beginning of it, I mean, 1.5 years ago, especially the Legislative Council that never started, and the cabinet now for the second time, the new cabinet after the joining of the Juba Peace Agreement, and they are reestablishing a new cabinet, and it has taken a long time. And now people are just waiting. And there are lots of politics and internal politics related to this. Every few days, they put it back several days. And so we are waiting and waiting and waiting. And of course, this adds to the pessimism that the looms, around. Lack of accountability systems and weakness of rule of law institutions is also a very prominent feature of the current situation. And also the proliferation of conflicts and tribal confrontations driven by elite interests and competition for power, accompanied by rumors and language of hatred in social media. And this is very clear with respect to East Sudan and Darfur, especially with the outbreak of violence, and that actually took lives of people in those regions. Now we move to more specific, area, that is the Juba Peace Agreement, which has been, signed in Juba, after the mediation of South Sudanese government for more than 2 months now. And although it has been widely welcomed by some, and also there are others who are reserved about it, but the most important thing is that it faces challenges. And these challenges are very important if they are actually to get a chance to implement it and to prove that it's working or it's going to work. Four more challenges are to be identified. The main one is regarding the absence of two major groups, Al Hilo and Abdul Wahid, who remain outside the peace agreement, both in South Kordofan and in Darfur, and that means the peace agreement itself is incomplete, and that is a problem in itself. Secondly, the East Sudan Agreement, or what they call the East Track, has been rejected by major groups in East Sudan, mainly the Bija and their allies. They have staged several demonstrations, and very peaceful ones, rejecting the whole agreement. In Bija, they're saying that they were not part of it and they were not represented in it. Number three, large groups of Sudanese consider the process as being not inclusive, in addition to poor representation of the FFC, the Freedom Forces, and the major forces of revolution. So it was more, classical government with rebel movements kind of thing. So it hasn't been a comprehensive thing to include other actors in the political scene. Number four, just like previous peace agreements, this was a more high-level process. So it was only the top government officials with the top leaders of the rebel movements, and it did not include conversation with grassroots communities. And we know that, as Omar has said, that the conflicts have been mainly in around resource sharing, natural resource, and within communities in different territories. And so the issue of ownership becomes important, when this agreement is to be applied on the ground, to be implemented. So for the Juba Agreement, what is required, because this is just starting, and they need to make benefit of the lessons learned from previous peace agreements, so in order to avoid, at least, in the implementation phase, they can, avoid some of the pitfalls. So there is a need for quick implementation of community prioritized peace dividends founded on a strategic programmatic development approach with an overarching theory of change. So people, in order to actually be the local communities, in order to be stabilized and wait for the dividends of peace, for the midterm and long-term dividends of peace to unroll, they need quick, dividends to be seen that will actually help. Also addressing urgent needs and concerns of war-affected communities in war zones, and this particularly refers to IDPs and returnees coming from outside, like in Darfur, there are refugees in Chad, so some of them are returning, and IDPs also, that many of them want to return to their original villages. So for these, their urgent needs is very important if they are to feel that something is happening and they want to become part of it. Also, there is a need for a buy-in of the peace process at grassroots level in all these areas to ensure communal ownership and participation. They have to, because they cannot just wait until there is something regarding implementation of some development projects, so that they start getting information about what the peace process is about. They have to be engaged in it from the beginning to know that there is a peace process and this is the features of it. And so when it comes, they become also part of it in terms of both making programs for what is to happen in their own areas, and also how to execute it. So participation and ownership is quite crucial. Yeah. And also building community peace and stability, reconciliations, and culture of coexistence, because much of these conflicts have also multiplied in cross-ethnic conflicts. It was not only a conflict between government forces and rebel movements. It also translated into communal conflicts among groups coexisting in the same area or neighboring areas. So this needs reconciliation and promotion of culture of coexistence. Also, there is a need for capacity building to enable close and efficient follow-up and monitoring systems to assess the enforcement of relevant agreements, plans, and programs. One of the things that we have learned from the previous peace agreement review is that there is a lack of coordination in order to deliver the implemented parts of elements of whatever plans that were made, and this is a problem that needs to be closely monitored. So the last part of the presentation, I hope I haven't taken all the time. This is just one screen now. Currently, we have seen more violence, both in East Sudan and in Darfur in particular. Most of you might have read about the very fierce situation that break of violence that happened in the city of Jenaina, the capital of West Darfur, where residents have been burned and looted, and people are now just the IDPs are now staying in state institutions, in government departments, in schools, and everything is actually brought to a standstill in West Darfur. And the situation is also bad in South Darfur, especially in the area called Greda, south of Niala. Previously, we saw also violence in East Sudan, particularly in Port Sudan and in Kassala. So the situation is bleak, and we expect even more violence to appear in other places. And so with respect to just few comments, we think that there has been a premature withdrawal of UNAMID without proper coordination with either the UNITAMIS or the government of Sudan in order to take over. And that was something that we have noticed even during our review of the DDS, and we cautioned for that. Also, there is severe ethnic polarization, and with much engagement of elites in different places, leaders and elites in large cities, and even the diaspora are involved in this ethnic polarization and using heavily social media. And if one just enters into any social media, you get a sense of polarization in the communities. And there is also an effect now of overflow of the Ethiopian civil war, and also the new border conflict in East Sudan with Ethiopia. This affects the situation in Eastern Sudan, not only as between the government of Sudan and government of Ethiopia, but because of the ethnic groups sharing borders across between Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. Whatever happens across the borders actually translates into more tension within Sudan itself, and especially in the east. So that's something to be watched.
Just wants to capitalize on that.
Yeah, exactly. So Omar is reminding me that this is when, just to link it to the point mentioned earlier, that the tension between the military and the civilians is always there. Now the East Sudan case is being, sort of monopolized or, manipulated by the military in order to actually mobilize the population to support the military in defending the borders of Sudan. And of course, the indirect effect of that is that it promotes the position of the military as credible political leaders of the country. And some of the actually supporters of the previous regime are actually getting into this conversation and asking the military to take over, because the civilian government is not able to constitute a good program, and so on and so forth. So we are, sliding into a dangerous track now. So what we think is about just 2 points about it. One, that a firm commitment and application of rule of law mechanisms is required from the central government, and also that we need a formation of a national level committee or committees to promote reconciliation in these areas, because the government alone cannot do something. We need more inclusive mechanism in order to promote reconciliation and actually put off the fires of violence in East and Darfur. Yeah. So presently, we are working on this. As PRI, we have already identified certain, agencies, people, and in the coming during the coming week, we are going to hold a series of meetings in order to bring this idea into light. Yeah, so with that, I stop, and sorry for taking a few more minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor Musa and Dr. Umar, for a very insightful presentation. I think it is very important for us to think about how many of the lessons that you have identified as part of your research on previous peace processes in Sudan are current realities, again, all over in Sudan. So it's very important for us to have this discussion, and I think we would like to hear more on that from you in the Q&A session. But now we will zoom out a little bit of Sudan and see how the lessons and challenges that you have identified were addressed elsewhere around the world. Our next speaker will be Professor Christine Bell. Christine Bell is the Director of the Political Settlement Research Program and Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Edinburgh. She received her law degrees from Cambridge and Harvard, and with her team, they have produced the PAX Peace Agreements database and written widely on peace processes and inclusion. Without further ado, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to begin by thanking the British Council and FCDO for supporting the event, but also to thank very much PRI and Professors Abdul Jalil and Igeme for inviting us to be involved in the event along with them. And I would like to congratulate them on their excellent research. And I feel I've really learned a lot from the presentation. What I'm going to do is make a few reflections just on some of the issues that have been talked about by Professors Abdul Jalil and Igeme with respect to how those have been issues in other processes, and what some of the strategies that other processes have used to try to deal with them. There's no suggestion, first of all, that I have specialist expertise on Sudan. The experts have already spoken, and neither is there any suggestion that lessons from other processes can be just lifted and applied, of course. But I think what lessons from comparative processes, and I speak, I suppose, from the personal experience of involvement in the Northern Irish peace process, what they do give is, if you like, a source of political imagination for how kind of mechanisms can be adapted and used across contexts. So I offer them really in that spirit. So first of all, to say, part of the reason I was really interested to participate in the event is that, as Hamid mentioned, we have created a large database of peace agreements from 1990 onwards. So we don't capture the 1972 Sudanese peace agreements, but we do capture any agreements back to 1990. We look at both national agreements and local agreements. And I'm just going to periodically share my screen to show you where, if you're interested, you can get access to the data. So we have these agreements on a peace agreement website, which I'm showing now, which is just simply at peaceagreements.org. And these agreements, I think, show, if we just look at Sudan, a lot of the agreements that were talked about. You can see even when I put in Sudan, that different agreements come up. And if I just sort of show that it quickly, you can see that actually from Sudan and across agreements from all the different stages of the conflict, right through from the pre-negotiation talks about talks through to implementation agreements. We had actually 104 agreements pulled up there. Some of those will not be agreements that just Sudan is involved in, but will also be agreements for Sudan supported peace processes in other countries. But really, I suppose the first point I would make from that is that often, and in fact, I think when we began putting together our data, we were really focused on these big moments of peace agreements. So for example, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement that addressed the conflict primarily between North and South Sudan. And I think often that international actors who come in supporting peace processes are very focused on this transactional elite deal of these big moments. But actually, if you really document the ways that parties and societies try to reach agreements to exit conflict, then we see that the process is much longer and deeper than that and involves very many more agreements on that. And the important point I would really make, and this is where I think the PRI research is so valuable, is that the patterns that are created in those earlier processes start to shape what is possible or not possible in later processes, and also shape, crucially, the faith that the public has in those processes. So we're certainly great advocates for research like this, that really starts to say, well, wait a minute, we've been here before. What can we learn? In what ways have those processes succeeded and failed? And a lot of our research is really about trying to enable people to do that in their own process and to look at similar examples and other ones. To just look a little bit then at one of the things we did was we tried to visualize processes. And I think this was also where the PRI research really resonated. So here we've mapped not just agreements, but actually peace processes. And this lovely line would be if you had the perfect peace process where you agreed a ceasefire, you entered talks about talks, you moved to agree certain issues, you reached a comprehensive agreement, and then you had this nice straight line of implementation. But this is what peace processes really look like. This is all the world's peace processes from 1990 onwards. And if I just sort of randomly land on one, there's one in a conflict that actually re-erupted really recently, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh. And that you can see that these processes go up and down, forwards and backwards. So this again, I think, is a lesson in the importance, I'm going to just come out for a minute, in the importance of the PRI research, because what it shows is that actually, I think we all instinctively know this, but I think the value of our data has been to absolutely categorically show it, that peace processes are not linear, they go forwards and backwards. Even when you implement new groups and new forms of conflict emerge. And really, I think for us, this is quite fundamentally reshaping how we're thinking about peace processes and their design. And in fact, I think many of the problems that the previous presentation showed have really resonated to us. So just to move on to that very quickly, one of the things I think, how do we respond from the comparative research to the types of dilemma which were presented in the last presentation, which Sudan is facing now? Well, just a couple of brief points, and we can explore these further in the question and answer and think about the lessons between the general comparative research and the specific case of Sudan. But first of all, that I think more and more we are moving away from the idea that a peace process often assumes that there is a thing called the conflict, and that they're trying to then reach an agreement to try to stop the actors in the conflict reaching it. What we see now is not one conflict, but lots of conflicts. And the presentation was a really good example of that. But also this is actually an issue that arises not just in Sudan. So often a conflict is not the conflict or a conflict, but what we are starting to call a complex conflict system. And it's a system of interrelated conflicts at local level that have a national dimension around who is going to be the national government, and that often have geopolitical dimensions. And I think the presentation that we just heard brought that out beautifully. What does that then mean for the peace process? Well, it means that we don't need one peace process, but we need multi-level peace processes. And these need to be at the national level, at the local level, and at the geopolitical level. However, often forms of process do exist at those levels. So I'm sure there are people brokering very hard in local areas that you're talking about. The PRA gave examples of what they were doing. And also there will be, of course, geopolitical and regional discussions around peace processes. So I think what is missing in these very contemporary contexts are effective forms and strategies of coordination between them. And in the absence of those forms of coordination, I think a couple of things are happening that, again, the presentation beautifully illustrated. Firstly, that the actors within any one peace process can game their position within that peace process by pulling the levers in the other levels. The East Sudan example, I think, was a very good illustration of that, where actually how the military engage in a border conflict that in some senses has a level of removal from the central transitional agreement. Levers can be pulled, which then affect the power balance. So the actors, while peace brokers are not necessarily adept at coordinating these processes, the actors are very adept at moving between the different levels. So I think there needs to be a matching agility of peace builders between these levels. And peace builders often do have the resources to engage at the multiple levels. What are the types of, the other thing I think that's very much resonated with where our current ideas are going from our comparative frame is the ways in which conflict fragments across this and becomes more complex over time. So we can maybe talk about that more in the discussion. I wanted to just give a few examples from other peace processes on the more positive note of how mechanisms that people have creatively used to address it. So if I'm searching deep within myself for my optimistic response to the talk, it's first of all that some processes have actually worked over time by dealing with different bits of the process. So while I think we see it as a failure, and I think the story that was told showed the failures, in fact, in Colombia, over really 20 or 30 years, by peeling off one armed acting group at a time, and by learning from the lessons of failure, a form of success has been reached, although it's still difficult. What was reached in the 2016 agreement between the FARC, that in some sense was just a final piece of a jigsaw around a series of agreements, and probably not the final piece. In fact, there's still another armed group active. I think what the lessons that were learned were to address root causes. So, for example, agrarian reform, never really addressed in any of the past peace processes, was a central plank of the agenda this time. I think the second thing that was addressed was really searching for forms of legal status and creative implementation of agreements, including using research projects like our own, the Peace Agreement Matrix project and CROP, to actually become part of the ongoing monitoring of the agreement. And bringing together researchers, peace builders, and also legal and technical mechanisms into a very complex but interesting attempt at implementation. And although that implementation has been less than perfect, it has carried the peace process through fundamental bumps in the road, a failed referendum, a change in government to a government much less bought into the peace agreement. The second thing I think that's really interesting is how groups are actually starting to understand the ways in which local agreement making needs to relate. The Kenya process was perhaps really one of the most interesting, I think, in the Kenyan crisis around 2008 and how that played out. One of the mechanisms they actually set out was a national peace building institution that then sort of quite creatively adopted its role in going into local communities, and particularly communities that had very fractious borderlands between different ethnic or tribal groups, and brokering and helping those groups renew their relationships through forms of local agreement. And those forms of local agreement then often jointly, and saw the groups invite in state security forces to help them manage the internal borderlands between the communities. So it both, I think, reached a very local agreement, but also started to extend the reach and the legitimacy of the state in certain ways. Again, not a perfect process. Kenyan actors would give you a much better critique of the process, but a creative idea, I think, that these types of local national institutions with local capacity can exist. So there's a few interesting examples of how people are starting to create these multi-level peace processes. The thinking's still new, the examples are still very new. And also, I think where I would end up, and what I think the PRI research is an amazing resource to, is the idea that maybe have to more fundamentally rethink how we're doing peace processes, to both layer in extra levels of social engagement, which is critically missing in many peace processes, we do still need armed actors and elite armed actors to make agreements with each other to stop fighting, to create a break point in conflict that can enable other things to happen. But there needs to be a wider set attention paid that intrinsic to that, being able to sustain for any amount of time and widen and deepen are these broader processes. And secondly, I think we need to think more clearly about how to coordinate and connect and keep moving forward on the multi-level peace processes at each level, local, national, regional or geopolitical. The lessons for this, and if Sudan helps solve this, I think the lessons and ramifications and positive learning are really massive and will be applied in lots of other peace processes. So there's an incentive to conflict resolution beyond your own conflict if you can help the world do this better. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Christine. This was very, very interesting. And thank you so much for ending, with a bit of positive notes on how many of these issues were addressed elsewhere. I think it's very important to try and look at the positive sides of things. And I think, one of the main things that stands out from what you have been speaking about and what PRI mentioned in the research and in their presentation now is the importance of further social inclusion in peace processes, and to make sure that the voices of the peoples are reflected and presented in a way or another. And on that note, we have finished our presentations now, and now we have about 30 minutes for questions and answers and discussion and so on. And we are very keen, to allow some good time for this. I would just please ask you if you could introduce yourself before you ask your question or make your comment, and please use the raising hand, or if like Dr. Jahi, you can do the same. Just to raise your hand or make put a question, comment in the chat box, and then I would invite you to join the floor. Okay, and I see, Dr. Ahmed Shahi, would you like to do the first question, please?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed the presentation of the three speakers, Musa, Omar, and Christine. Very interesting and very detailed. I got really very short questions, interrelated questions. One, they talk about national agenda, the two first speakers. What is it? Who is propounding it? And will it be accepted as a legitimate institution appealing to the rest of the Sudanese? And related to this, don't you think there is an enormous gulf between Khartoum and the periphery, wherever that periphery may be, whether in the north, west, or Kordofan? That is a real problem successive government has not addressed institutionally. There's always Khartoum has to impose itself on the periphery. And finally, it seems to me if the two speakers address that the previous peace processes failed, surely they should propound democracy where people can be elected from various parts of the Sudan and let them battle it out in parliament about the future of Sudan, rather than piecemeal processes. Piecemeal would not work. It has to be, the East has to listen to the West, and the West has to listen to the North and to Kordofan. So these are, I don't want to take more time, but these are three issues which I have elaborated from the talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would suggest that we take a couple more questions or comments, and then we'll go back to the panel for answers and comments. Abid Shah.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Thank you so much for the presentations. They were very informative. My name is Abid. I've completed my PhD from the University of Bath. I was focusing on, actually my research was a political ethnography of a conflict zone called Fatah in Pakistan, which is bordering Afghanistan. And I was using a political settlement framework. And actually I was looking at a transition from a conflict zone to a sort of democratization in Fatah region, but I was more concerned with the ability of actors, and not only the political power in terms of military strength, or but also on the social and entrepreneurial skills that they have. In some cases, those who participated within the wars, they might have those military strength, but they lacked in the abilities to impart justice, let's suppose, if they are in power. So they lacked legitimacy. So in that sense, I mean, has anyone focused, my question is, in Darfur, Sudan, on how useful political settlements would be if we were to focus on the social and entrepreneurial skills of the actors? And the second question is, in my research, I have been focusing regional-wise. So there are certain areas where the temperature of conflict was high. The response or the peace processes or the settlements required a different template region-wise. So there was no uniformity. And someone, I mean, Christine was quite right when she said some were short-term, some were long-term. But I mean, is a short-term settlement, which may be temporary, can also be a political settlement in the case of Darfur, or should we have a mixture of short-term, long-term, regional-wise? So in other words, should we zoom in further and focus more on region-specific, like even when if it is a small area, and have customized settlements? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kedrick.
Hi, thanks. I mean, thanks very much to everybody for really excellent presentations. I just wanted to ask what might be different this time round. So we've looked at past peace processes and individual peace processes. What's the difference now for this JPA? Thanks very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think it would be good to go back to the panel now, and then I will go back to the questions in the chat and other raised hands. Would you like to go first, Professor Musa and Dr. Abdel Jalil, on Dr. Ahmed Al-Shahi questions on national agenda, who enforces that, and the gap between Khartoum and the peripheries, and also the issue of part meal processes? Would you like to go on that? And then also, we can also take all of the questions together from Abchas on the Darfur, how can political settlements focus on the skills of actors, entrepreneurial skills of actors, and should we focus more on short-term peace agreements that focus on specific regions, or have a mixture between that and having a more long-term and more wider agreement? And then finally, from Kedrick, what's different now? Would you like to go ahead? You are on mute. Could you please unmute?
Okay. Well, I think you can continue. Maybe just very quickly, and Professor Ahmed Al-Shahi, I'm very pleased to see you. And thanks for your question. I will just go very briefly. The national agenda, I think your question is very legitimate. And in fact, this is one of Sudan's problem. And still, there is no agreement on a national agenda. And there is no agreement on at least what we could call a long-term vision for Sudan. And this is one of the main issues the country is struggling with. And I think one of the, even in the last statements by the Prime Minister, Dr. Abdullah Hamdok, he came to a conclusion, and explicitly he said one of our problems at present is the lack of a national agenda. And I think the possibilities for that are there. There is it is possible to go for that, but it needs a lot of work, at least at different levels, from the community to the states and to the national level. I think importantly is the commitment of the elite. This is one of the major problems of Sudan. Is now most of the political agenda, and even development agenda are, populated by the elite from the different regions. And I think you know Sudan very well, and it has been one of the predicaments of Sudan. And this applies to your second question, is the prominence of Khartoum, that as a center of politics and economics. And this is why always you find this, antagonistic relationship between the center and the peripheries. And in fact, all the political movements in Sudan today, which we could trace back to the late 50s, are regional movements, regional against the hegemony of Khartoum itself in terms of politics and economics. And I think this is an issue that has to be addressed. Maybe one of the major gaps in Sudan is the local government. This is the third layer of the government, and usually it was left behind. Localities or local councils that are mandated to deal with the everyday of the life of the people are usually the weakest part of the governance structure in Sudan. I will leave it to Professor Musa if he has additional to, yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, Omar. Thank you.
Hi, Ahmed. Good to see you.
Nice to see you both. Very nice.
Yes. Yeah, I will just add a small point to Omar's comment regarding the early elections. Actually, the Sudanese public has been divided about the elections. Some of them see that early elections are important because then they will define the political weight of different groupings, so that at least we know who has what kind of constituency, and on that basis the political conversation and power struggle can be defined. Others see that no, if we go to the elections, then conventional political parties might utilize different illegal means, and they can win the elections, and therefore will fall into the trap of just a vicious circle. And this is a debate that is going on, and I think maybe we will head ultimately into early elections. Regarding Abid's point, I think the idea of customized settlements look very attractive, given Christina's point about the multiple levels of conflicts, and how it's important that we don't just have one peace process at one level. So that means we can start different processes at different levels and have a way of coordinating and synergizing them, so that at the end we produce one coherent political environment that can promote stability for the whole community. And also regarding Cedric's question about how different the Juba Peace Agreement is, I think it is very close to the previous peace agreements, especially that it's been mediated according to the usual power sharing, wealth sharing model, which is being advocated by international actors. And this actually translates into the Sudanese context as dividends for the elites, power dividends for the elites. So they are thinking about who is getting which ministry and who is getting which position, and then they scramble for the positions. So what started as something that may be theoretically attractive as power sharing, it will be translated as just a scramble for positions of individuals. And where does the community fits? Then the community, they will hear about it after several months, and not immediately. So that is a big problem. Maybe the only difference between Juba and the peace agreements is the condition under which it's done. In the previous peace agreements, we had a government that was actually not genuine about the peace. So it was not willing to implement the peace agreement. And they did say so in different equations, that they just bowed to the will of international community, but they did not intend to implement it. But now we have a government that genuinely wants to implement peace. So, I mean, that is a big chance for the Juba Peace Agreement.
And also the constituency for peace. I think the constituency of peace is also expanding enormously in Sudan, especially after December revolution. And at least the conviction and recognition among the different stakeholders, Sudan long path to development cannot be built without reaching lasting peace. And this is a conviction held by all the different actors. And I think this is also one of the differences. But at the same time, just to refer to Abid Shah, I think, the long way to democratization, the economy is an entry point. Building skills, entrepreneurship, building the capacities of the actors. It is one of the main entry points to build long-term stabilization and democratization. But that also needs a lot of investment, at least for skills to be built, for people to access the markets. I think there is a lot of prerequisites to be in place. Also, we have to look at the other side of the conflict. For example, in Darfur, I think the unforeseen positive aspects of the conflict is the expansion of the civil society, the emergence of women as active actors in the political process, whether as demonstrators or as pressure groups, and even the economic situation of so many of those people, I think, is affecting the whole process. It is also, we can talk about long and short-term processes to peace, but I think there is no one size that fits all, but it depends on the contextual realities of the space, and sometimes we may opt for a hybrid between long-term and short-term peace processes. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahmed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Christine, would you like to come in?
I'll just speak briefly to Kedric's point and Abid Shah's point from a more comparative perspective. I suppose from outside of the process, one of the things that I see as different is, I suppose, the dynamic of the agreement. So very much the Juba Agreement came out of the revolutionary moment, civilian pushback, and is thought of, I think, in terms of a transition to democracy. Whereas if we look at the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, it was very much around a kind of transition from conflict. Now, of course, conflict, peace and democracy kind of go together, but we've been very aware from looking at the global data that there's slightly different models of doing it. One is a Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and the other is a transition agreement. And the Juba Agreement very much falls, although there are similarities with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, it very much more falls in this kind of transitional arrangements with processes put in. And we've put up links in the chat to things we've written on the dynamics and of those types of transition process, but they are a little bit different. And in fact, academic literature hasn't dealt with them so much as it has with peace processes. I think some of the dynamics are the same then in terms of the brokerage at the centre and the type of peace project at the centre of the state, and how the peripheries and other groups and interests are dealt with at the edge of the state. But I guess the frame of what the project of the peace process is a little bit different than it was before. In terms of the local agreements, yes, I think reaching very context-specific deals at the level of the periphery, and particularly where there are different conflict dynamics, and in some areas there won't be conflict dynamics at all, really, so are really important. And in fact, mostly when we have uncovered complex things and started asking questions about local agreements, we find they're nearly always there. In fact, people are actually doing this all the time. It's just, it's not often recognized as an important part of the process. Those deals, I think, are experience of ones we've collected. We have a whole bit on the database, which you'll see on the front page of peaceagreements.org on local agreements, where you can explore what people are doing in such versions. We're very aware that not all of these agreements are written down, so that will only be a little snapshot of what's out there across the countries in the world. But often the settlements are quite temporary because they're about re-establishing relationships. But what I would say, and this is a little bit my response on the national level too, I think it's quite useful to look at agreements as agendas for change and then map them against the agendas for change that wider society knows need to happen. So often, and as far as possible, if the agendas for change that are needed can be referenced in the peace agreement, it's a mechanism for bringing these two things together. So where you know that forms of local agreement need to take place, and those forms of local agreement can start to address the root causes in that local area, there's often a bit more scope to say, well, if this agenda, if something that we know needs to change, what are the things that we would know would need to change if peace was to be realised? Can we map those out and get those into a list? And then can we use that to try to say, why is the peace process not addressing this, and to suggest reasons why it can. Certainly, I think years and years ago, when I was leading a human rights group that was very much trying to broaden the agenda, there'd been many peace agreements in Northern Ireland, a very famous one that had been tried to do very similar things to the 1998 agreement as far back as 1973. And in those agreements, there was really an attempt to just broker an elite pact and not to address the wider issues, but by kind of creating a notion of the agenda for change being broader, even though we couldn't say exactly how it all fit together. I think that was, and even though we had no real power in the situation, you know, we weren't standing for election, we didn't have guns, and these were the things that gave you power. Actually, when the parties came to seeing how they might really generate change, having created, even from outside the process and even from our sort of fairly minor status as human rights advocates, having created a sense of what the wider ingredients had to be if peace was to be achieved, was actually hugely influential in the ultimate text of the peace agreement. So I would say that these wider thoughts, of which PRI is a part of, about how to create that broader social contract, you know, if articulated strongly and clearly, I think can have forms of traction that are surprising. So in other words, if there's no national agenda for change, who's creating it? And even if there's no hope of getting it, who's continuing to say, what are the building blocks of the types of change that need to happen?
Thanks, Christine. I will bring in some of the questions from the chat now before I open the floor for more contributions. Isra is asking about the importance of working on reforming national conflict resolution mechanisms like the Constitutional Court and the justice sector and so on, in parallel to having working on the peace processes and so on, and how it's important to guarantee, you know, the success of the peace process in question. Another question from Brian is about the role of new actors that have emerged in the scene, particularly in Sudan, like the resistance committees in neighborhoods and so on, and what role can such informal institutions play in building a more inclusive supporting a more inclusive peace process. And then one final question is about from Jan about the midterm perspectives for bringing in the two excluded groups that did not sign the peace deal yet, SPLM North Abdelaziz El-Hilu and SLM Abdel Wahid Noor. Yeah, so over to you, Professor Musa and Dr. Umar to answer some of these questions, and then Christine can also come in.
Maybe about yes. I will go directly to answer the question on the resistance committees as one of the new features of the new age or period of Sudanese politics. Certainly, the toppling of the regime was successfully achieved through the involvement of the youth, whose role was very critical, and of course the youth have organized themselves in the form of the resistance committees. So the resistance committees now actually symbolize the spirit of the December Revolution in Sudan, but unfortunately they are not, part of the governance structure up to now. That is why what my colleague Omar was saying about the importance of local government, that's the level where many of us think that the resistance committees ought to be engaged at the local governance level. But unfortunately, of course, the local government structure has not been reformed, and of course the practice that is going on is inherited from the previous regime, where actually decision making has been firmly centralized, despite the rhetoric about federal governance, whatever, but everything was actually managed centrally. So that means we need to depart from this spirit of centralization, which actually used to characterize everything, including even the definition of the national agenda, because it's top down and the central elites are the ones who are defining what is the agenda. So the resistance committees, actually, they are talking very differently. Many of them are rejecting all the existing political parties, even without providing an alternative. But this shows how different they are from the ongoing dynamics of the old political club. And if enough attention is given to their pledges, we can see another cycle of confrontation and struggle towards democratization in Sudan, which is difficult to say which way it is going to go. Even now, we are seeing road blockages, stand-ins, demonstrations at this time. Before the formation of the new cabinet. So I do agree that it is important to pay attention to these resistance committees and really maybe to study them and understand their dynamics, who's moving them, whatever, because we don't have enough information. This is an area, this is a gray area that needs fresh research.
Okay, I can just jump in very quickly on the importance of reforming conflict resolution mechanisms. It is a real, very interesting, and it is a very hot issue now in discussion in Sudan about conflict resolution mechanisms and the possibilities of reforming, because historically and culturally founded institutions for conflict resolution are the indigenous institutions, the indigenous cultural institutions referred to as in Sudan as tribal institutions or the native administration. These are the institutions that we have been inherited, and still, in spite of of the erosion of the power of many of the tribal leaders over the past 50 years through political manipulation, politicization, and the weakening of these institutions with the communities, but still they are viable structures, and whenever there are serious conflict, people opt to these institutions. They are still have legitimacy on the ground. However, I think one of the maybe of the most important thing is not to in Sudan. In fact, there is a lot of discussion since the 60s about these institutions, but they have proved their resilience and their legitimacy, but they still need to be reformed, at least how to be relevant to the changing world of human rights, issues of democratization, inclusivity, because also issues of how women are to be included as part and parcel, how they use. I think these are issues that people have to should address very clearly. And but we do see how these institutions could be gradually capacitated and reformed to at least to cope with the challenges of our time. Removal or dismantling of these institutions will never help Sudan in any way. But what we see is how these institutions can be reformed, can be capacitated, and even how to be democratized and to be more inclusive institutions. And there is a lot of possibilities for that. Regarding the midterm, perspective of bringing those who are still outside the process, mainly Al-Hilu in South Kordofan and Abdul Wahid in the south in Darfur. The negotiations with Al-Hilu are going on, and still a lot of discussion has been held. Even the small workshops, to bridge the gap between the government and Al-Hilu is still are still held. Even the last workshop, I think, finished 3 days back. There is a process going on, and it is the anticipation that Abdul Aziz will join very soon. Also for Abdul Wahid, in spite of his very strong position, always claiming that the Juba Peace Process has not addressed the root causes of the conflict, and still he is very at least skeptical about how the issue of the IDPs is to be addressed. I think there are some glimpses, because he started to appear on the TV, started to talk to the people, and we do see this is also maybe at least a hint or an insight that he will join. But still, it needs time. It needs a lot of effort from the government of Sudan, as well as from the partners of the government of Sudan, particularly in countries where those guys are settled.
Do you have any comments for now, or do you want me to?
No, I don't really have any comments. I think they were specific on Sudan and are really well answered.
Sure. So there is one more question on the chat box that's asking about the deepening fragmentation among the SRF, the signatories to the Juba Peace Process, and how would these conflicts within this group affect the peace process and the peace agreement, really. And one more question that I would add is about the role of international community and what can international actors do, particularly in the current situation in Sudan. and would be good to get perspectives both from PRI, but also from Christine.
Yeah, about the fragmentation. Yeah, I will go first. I will answer the question about the fragmentation of the groups. This is, of course, not it's not a new thing. And many these are we are used to this from the previous peace agreements also, that a group might start a peace process until they reach the agreement, and then fragmentation takes place after the peace agreement is signed. That means they disagree on implementation protocols, and this actually is a function of the model that is used in mediating peace process. I think this is the wrong model that the international mediating bodies have adopted, and they are using it in the sense of one size fits all. They have just they consider that these groups, they need to share power and share wealth, and therefore if you offer them this model of power and wealth sharing, they will come in and they become partners. The problem is that it is the communities that have been suffering from whatever problems of marginalization and lack of development, which are the root causes of the conflicts themselves. So you cannot address the root causes of conflicts by offering the elites of the rebel movements power positions and economic incentives. This is not matching. There is no match by in terms of analysis of the conflict and the recipe of the peace agreement. They don't match, and as long as they do not match, we'll always have people going back to the bush, because they have not been satisfied with the piece of cake that was offered to them. So I'm not surprised about that, and actually I expect more splintering to take place even during the implementation phase, and that cannot be answered unless we go back to the drawing board and change the modality of negotiation itself to give power to the people, to the communities, and also and the power should not be defined in terms of a position, but in terms of the ability to influence policies and decision making, and that should not rest with an individual, but should be a mechanism that answers to the community. It has to trickle down. So we have to have committees, commissions, people involved until a decision comes out. And the same thing for the wealth and the economic benefits.
Okay, just to respond to the question about what the international community could do, I think, the removal of the name of Sudan from the list of terrorism, I think, has opened a new horizon for Sudan and a new link with the international community. And this is, I think, it's a big opportunity for Sudan to capitalize on, and even for the friends of Sudan and for the international community. It makes a lot of difference for engagement with Sudan. I think one of the major problems facing Sudan at the present is over the last 30 years, there is a complete destruction of the governance institutions. And this is particularly in relation to civil service and also in relation to the economic institutions and rule of law institutions. I think maybe a new engagement, having the current economic crisis, engagement with the, or incorporation of the Sudan in the international economic system, and particularly its engagement with the economic institutions like the World Bank and the MIF is maybe a new area that at least to help, to stabilize the economy of the country. But besides the economy, I look at, institutional capacity building. How, the government institutions are to be capacitated, new governance structures, capacities in place at least to manage, not only peace, even to manage the recovery and the development process. Over the last 30 years, even qualified staff from the ministries are no longer existing. Most of the staff and the capable people have been sacked by the previous government. Even the government institutions were managed from outside the government apparatus, from parallel structures by the NCP. So this is an area, I think, where Sudan badly needs support in. In addition, as Professor Musa mentioned previously, the peace agreement is still hanging in the air. It is, just owned by the federal government and even by a few in the federal government, but by the rebel movements and the government negotiators. How to localize these agreements and to be owned by the communities, I think this is an area where the internationally could provide the required support. How, the communities at the state and local level, and this is also an area where we could redefine the social contract between the state and society. Long years of disengagement, communities disengagement from the government disengaging from its society. How to bridge this gap? I think it's an area where the international community could help. And finally, the capacities for peace. I think is still Sudan lacks, the genuine capacities to at least to translate the agreements into genuine peace processes, and especially how this could transform or reflected in a positive dimension or positively on the livelihoods of the people. I think these are issues where the international community could provide support.
Thank you very much, Dr. Umar. Before I pass the floor to Professor Christine, if you could just very briefly respond to the question on the chat about the viability of tribal chiefs as an institution on a post-conflict reconstruction scenario, or Professor Musa, just very briefly. We're already 5 minutes over time, and then I will move to Christine for final.
Can I clarify the question, please?
Yes, please, but just very quickly.
Okay, thank you. In my research in the Fatah region, the national agenda always supported the persistence of colonial structure of the system of tribal chiefs as an institution, which had been working fine till the Afghan war and the war on terror. What we saw in the war on terror was a complete destruction of the tribal chiefs, and as an institution, around 1,500 tribal chiefs were killed. So the replacements of tribal chiefs, they did not have the same skills as the experienced tribal chiefs. So in a post-conflict scenario, the reforms in the traditional structure, they were problematic because if there were to be reforms in the judicial systems, the new players or the new actors, those who supported the state in the war on terror, who took over the tribal chiefs that were killed, they were lacking in judicial skills. They had only mercenary skills. So, I mean, is this the same case in Sudan? I mean, this makes it more problematic because if you don't have the support of the tribal chiefs as an institution, any institutional transition becomes problematic as well. Because what we found in our case study in FATA was most of the new political players, they resided outside the regions. They were mostly living in cities, so they had that disconnect with their local people and the tribal chiefs were actually there. So democratization or liberal democracy and the traditional systems that is on offer to the local community and the local people, I mean, people are still deciding, and its response is coming different in different regions. In some regions, liberal democracy acceptance is high. In other cases, it's low. And that's why I was referring to the social and entrepreneurial skills of local elites, especially, and how do they take part in these processes? Do we find the same kind of decline in the profile of tribal chiefs in Sudan, or is it different? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abid. Very briefly, please, Professor Musa and Dr. Umar.
And actually, I would say that we have similar situation to that mentioned in here, whereby the tribal chiefs previously they had all their own skills in dispute settlement, in judicial processes, informal judicial processes. That tradition did not die out completely, and many actually, tribal chiefs actually they trained a new generation of people because that is related to the identity of groups, and therefore we are seeing now a new generation of even university graduates taking over the chieftainships of sections and paramount chieftainships, and therefore injecting a new level of expertise to that. But the problem we have in Sudan is that the urban elites who are defining the political agenda of the country, many of them lack faith in the political or in the capacity of the traditional office holders, and they think that they are against their agenda. So mainly the radical groups of the left and the right, the Islamist groups and the communists and the leftists, they are both of them are against what we call native administration, which is the term that refers to traditional chiefs in Sudan, and then they want them to be removed, to the extent that actually there has been legal ordinances ending their power in the past during Numer's regime. So this is the sort of problems that we are facing in Sudan. But it's still, despite the fact that they have been politicized during the Bashir regime, but still they retain relevance to the conflict resolution simply because they have the institutional memory for land tenure and natural resource management, which is not registered, which is not surveyed, and it's not in modern cadastral system. And they are the only people who have that memory for about it. So any solution for the problems that we are seeing in the rural areas must include them.
Thank you very much.
You are right. It's even recognized and legitimated by the people.
Thank you very much. I will now hand over to Christine to just thank you for posting the paper about the role of international actors. If you could just quickly speak to that and any final remarks in a minute or so, because we are way over time. Thank you.
I mean, I think international actors bring a number of resources, and they've been touched on originally, but forms of technical support and capacity support for projects that have a more technical dimension around reform. and obviously funds and how they incentivize them. I suppose looking from outside of both the international community and Sudan, our observation would be that there's often not good coordination between the different international actors and donors, and that ideally, if there are national agendas for change being created, that they could mobilize and decide which piece they can take. That's useful. And I think coming back to the point about entrepreneurship, understanding again what are the types of immediate socioeconomic returns that can be made to move things forward in training. I just wanted to say one example in response to the chiefs thing. One of the most interesting examples I came across where these sorts of patterns were there, a very, very different context, but Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, where I visited 2 summers ago, interestingly, they sort of brought all these things together and created, they do these national reconciliation ceremonies, which involve the combatant groups formally handing power back to chiefs. Interestingly, in the contemporary situation there, women, for example, are now chiefs in certain areas. But also women's groups had really, really lobbied in the government bill, because there was no real local government until the peace process, to get 1-for-1 representatives at the local level of women and men. So they both created a local government structure and actually brought in really strong gender equality measures that probably could not have been achieved at the national level. What's really interesting then is that village committees sit to engage with development, and those committees are made up of a mixture of the local government representatives, representatives of women's groups, of combatant groups, and the chiefs. So in other words, they bring everybody together in a structure that can start to articulate the local needs. So it's just a very creative local process that has happened a bit under the radar, and is underpinned then by these national reconciliation ceremonies that involve these local groups at a very local level, but also reconciling with the state actors. So the state actors go for these ceremonies. The government of Papua New Guinea, the government of Autonomous Region of Bougainville all go to these ceremonies. And around the central ceremony, there's actual brokerage happening of groups, and youth go and have quite a prominent part. So just a very sort of creative mechanism that actually started to bring these things together in unusual ways, that both related to the traditional sources of power, to new sources that were being left out like youth, and to inclusion of women, and creating that in a connected way into a local government framework. So I think there's some interesting examples out there to look at. I'd just like to say in conclusion on my part that it's been super interesting. I've learned so much about the Sudan process. If there's any way we can use any of the comparative research we have, and all of it is made so people can access it and use it themselves without us, but if anyone wants any support in doing that, the team here would be really happy to help that and do whatever we can, because it is clear that the work you're doing is so important. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. And with that, we come to an end. Thank you very much to our distinguished speakers for the very interesting presentations and the discussion. And thank you all, everyone. This has been very insightful and useful. And hopefully we can organize more of these virtual events, given the importance of this topic. Thank you all very much. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.
Thank you, Hamid. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Hamid.
all.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Cedric.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.